Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I want to go back to Hong Kong for a while. We haven't talked about the Hong Kong protests, and they're back in the news. And part of the things that are in the news, there's several headlines across a lot of the interwebs. One is that the Hong Kong protesters have taken to using their money as a way of protesting against the totalitarian regime in China by refusing to spend and limiting where they use their dollars, which is going to have a dramatic impact on the economy. Two, a couple of people that serve on the police watchdog group have resigned, and that's creating more turmoil for the Hong Kong government. But there's a third thing that I think is not being discussed enough in U.S. media. You know, I listen to a lot of tech blogs, read a lot of tech websites, just simply because I'm a geek and I love technology. Well, what's being missed is that the Chinese regime has now launched an offensive against a popular online forum that was being used by the protesters, and China's doing this to try to undermine the ongoing pro-democracy movement, and all they're trying to do is, retain an autonomous Hong Kong. All of this was discovered by AT&T Cybersecurity. They have a new blog post. It's not actually new. It was posted on December 4. I just now discovered it, in which they say that the firm identified a series of state-linked cyber attacks going all the way back to August, the end of August, targeting HINKG, that is a localized Reddit-like social media forum. So just imagine, any sort of internet forum, particularly Reddit. This is like a Reddit. And of course, the Hong Kong protesters are using that as a way to organize and get their protests moving. That platform has become a hub for these activists trying to organize and coordinate their protests. And the latest attacks against the forum apparently started back on November 25. Dubbed the, quote, Great Cannon, distributed denial of service. You've probably heard of the acronym DDoS, distributed denial of service, in which cyber attacks try to attack, and this is in layman's terms, so all you tech geeks, just turn your ears off for a minute. What a distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack is where you use bots and you use other kinds of internet traffic to overload services in an attempt to overload the services of a particular website, a platform, whatever it might be. For example, someone might do a distributed denial of service attack on the iHeart backbone so that, you couldn't download podcasts, you couldn't listen to radio stations from around the country because the servers would be so overwhelmed by this traffic directed at the servers that they couldn't handle the traffic and the server shut down. Well, they call this the Great Cannon. And the attacks works by, in this particular case, it worked by intercepting traffic from China-based servers and then inserting malicious JavaScript to millions of internet users, then hijacking those users' connections to then bombard the targeted site with traffic, causing the victim's server to crash. Now, there was a report back in 2015 by Citizen Lab. This is a group out of Canada. And they found that the Great Cannon, this distributed denial of service protocol, actually shares the same infrastructure as China's sophisticated online censorship mechanism. That's known as the Great Firewall. So you got the Great Firewall, you got the Great Cannon. Anybody worry about the internet in this country? Well, you should. According to the report, the Great Cannon is, quote, not simply an extension of the Great Firewall, but is a distinct attack tool that hijacks traffic and then can arbitrarily replace unencrypted content as a man in the middle. That malicious code that they insert sends constant requests to the LIHKG, that so-called Reddit homepage, in an attempt to cripple it. The code then targets a bunch of memes and websites that appear on that website, most likely in an attempt to make the number of requests received by LIHKG to actually kind of blend in with the normal traffic, so that you can't necessarily pinpoint it. It just seems like suddenly your traffic is going off the chart. But the requests from the Great Canon also go so far as to direct LIHKG to unnecessarily process remote memes to a new size, increasing the size of that meme that they're served to the user, which means that ends up draining the server's computational resources. It just overwhelms the servers. Now, according to AT&T cybersecurity researcher Chris Doman, these hijacking activities are actually unlikely to succeed because of the robust anti-distributed denial of service that LIHKG has in place, and because of some bugs in the code itself. Now, what I don't know, and I've tried to dig around and see if I can find out whether this is true or not. But if it is true that LIHKG, the Hong Kong Reddit service, has a really strong, robust anti-distributed denial of service code in its servers, in its platform, my guess is they've done that in anticipation of a foreign government, not necessarily foreign in this case. I don't think you can, when you're talking about Hong Kong, I'm not sure you can refer to China as a foreign government necessarily. But I think they've done it knowing that their so-called neighbor just to the north, just across the border, would at times or all the time constantly be trying to insert distributed denial of service code into their system. So this guy from AT&T Cybersecurity said it was really disturbing to see the renewed use of such cyber weapons that are, again, quote, causing collateral damage to U.S.-based services. Now, in a post dated back August 31st, LIHKG said that it had suffered from unprecedented DDoS attacks in the past 24 hours, with more than 1.5 billion total requests and a maximum of more than 6.5 million unique visitors per hour, which they say led to internet congestion and overload on their servers. The Hong Kong website, LIHKG, also said that there were reasons to believe that a national power was behind these orchestrated attacks. And, of course, they expressed appreciation to the internet security provider Cloudflare for mitigating the attacks. If you're not familiar with Cloudflare, we're rebuilding a new website for me, for my personal website. And on my old website, I used Cloudflare, which keeps almost a mirror image of your website, or in this case, my website, keeps a mirror image of that site on a separate server, so that if the server or the host of my website is attacked by a DDoS attack, you'll get an error message that says, error message 404, page not available, whatever it might be, and redirect you to try Cloudflare. Cloudflare does a great job of doing this. And so LIHKG used Cloudflare as a backup to try to avoid these DDoS attacks. But then on June 12, Telegram's Pavel Durov reported that, quote, a state actor-sized, close quote, DDoS attack with a majority of the IP addresses coming from China. And then on June 12 was the day that around 2 million Hong Kongers went to the streets demanding that the local government withdraw that extradition bill because the protesters, rightfully so, saw that as eroding Hong Kong's rule of law, free from the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So on the same date that there was this state actor-sized DDoS attack, and a majority of the IP addresses as a part of that attack were coming from China, that was the same day that about 2 million Hong Kongers took to the streets to protest. Causal link? Correlation? I don't have evidence of a causal link, except for the majority of the IP addresses came from China. I think there is a causal link between the two. Then you fast forward from June to the end of August of 2017. Great Cannons, that same system, took aim at a New York-based Chinese language news website called HINKG News. And again, AT&T Cybersecurity said that it's continuing to observe attacks over the past year, and noted that the JavaScript code in the August attack against HINKG was very similar, if not identical, to that used to target HINKG News. Now you go back to March of 2015. GitHub, which is a Microsoft-owned software sharing platform, they experienced the largest DDoS attack in its history, with the intent of forcing that platform to remove a very specific class of content, according to GitHub. And the volume of malicious code and traffic paralyzed that website for 5 full working days. Now, in the same month that occurred, Great Fire, the nonprofit that dedicates itself to monitor and counter the Chinese regime's internet censorship, also experienced multiple attacks. That organization said the requests totaled to as many as 2.6 billion requests per hour, which is almost 2,500 times the normal level of traffic. The timing of the attacks coincided with the increased pressure from what's called Cyberspace Administration of China. That's the country's internet regulator. It calls Great Fire an anti-China website and has been pressing its IT partners to cease collaboration with that website. So there in a nutshell, you have, I think, a short but very important news story about the cyber attacks that China is doing to suppress the Hong Kong protesters. Now, why do I think this story is important? One, because I support the Hong Kong protesters. I don't know if they'll ever gain autonomy back from China, but in my prayers, I pray that they will. But I think we have a lesson to learn for us. I know, for example, a couple of days ago, Comcast, I'm going to call them out. Comcast had an internet, television, telephone, everything outage right here in my home studio. And of course, I have redundancy, just so you know, the former FEMA director has redundancy. So even though the family wasn't able to watch television or the telephones didn't work, any of that, I was still able to access the internet because I have a redundant system that if Comcast doesn't work, then I can go to T-Mobile and I can use T-Mobile for my internet access. I simply do that because I don't trust ISPs, internet service providers. When you tell me that your downtime is less than 1%, I calculate that means that 1% of the time, I'm not going to have internet access. And more likely than not, that's not going to occur between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. when I used to snore, no longer snoring, when I'm sound asleep. It's going to occur when I'm trying to do work. So, and by the way, so as long as I'm blasting Comcast, the first message, which I always find hilarious, I got the messages because I had switched over from Comcast to my T-Mobile service. And now they're sending me emails about when they're going to restore service. We're going to have it restored by 1:15. And then it's 4:15. And then it's 6:15. And then it's sometime after midnight. Well, if I don't have service, how am I supposed to be getting those emails? But I digress. That's why you should have redundancy, particularly if you are a home-based business or you do any sort of, work from home, or for that matter, it doesn't make any difference anywhere. I have the T-Mobile redundancy with me wherever I go, so that even if iHeart goes down at the studios, I've got the capability of still accessing the internet. And trust me, the internet's gone down at iHeart, sometimes because the IT people do the wrong things at the wrong time of day. I don't know why you would do updates or resetting of servers that are going to take hours on end in the middle of the workday. But I digress again. The broader point that I wanted to make about this China story in Hong Kong is this. We must always be vigilant. No matter what kind of new modern technology we have that we believe gives us more freedom, more choice, more ability to exercise our right of free speech, to protest against our government, to do whatever it is, don't take those for granted. Because you never know. And I'm not saying the United States is there. Well, actually, I kind of do know the United States is kind of there. Because I do know some of the things that we are able to do. For example, in a national emergency, you've probably seen those tests. You've heard the tests on radio and other place that in the event of an actual emergency, you would have been instructed to do such and such. Well, what I can tell you about that without violating classification rules is that the federal government now has the ability to take control of the broadcast airwaves. How long before the federal government has the ability to take control of the internet backbone? How long? Oh, I know. I don't think it's going to happen today. And even if it happened today and it was a true national emergency, I'm fine with that. But I don't like the idea of having the ability to do a kill switch on the internet or to do a distributed denial of service like China's doing in Hong Kong. I don't like governments having that capability. And you ought to be aware of it. You ought to be aware of it because all of these, you're listening to this podcast. I always look to see the majority of you that listen to the podcast listen on mobile devices, primarily mobile phones. But people also listen on laptops, desktops, tablets, everything. Imagine your dependency on all of those devices suddenly being taken away, not because Comcast, screws up a cable somewhere, but because your government has decided that you're protesting too much. That's what's happening in Hong Kong. And mark my words, every government, there's a bureaucrat somewhere that would love to have that power and that ability. Governments should fear their people. Governments, however, should be limited like ours and should not be able to take away something like the internet. Thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure and drop me a line if you'd like to comment about these cybersecurity attacks in China or the internet backbone. You can find me on Twitter at Michael Brown USA or on my Facebook page at Michael D. Brown, all one word. You can follow the show at Michael Brown Unplugged. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Michael Brown Unplugged. You know the drill on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, actually wherever you're listening to this right now. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a 5-star rating and a review. Michael Brown Unplugged is written by me, produced by Right Turn Media, and the marketing and social media is by Whole Crowd. Thanks again for listening to Michael Brown Unplugged.